She was supposed to be grateful. That was the deal. A roof over her head, a man who needed a wife, and a life in the Alberta foothills that most women back east would have called an adventure. Cordelia Vane had other words for it. She stepped off the coach in Pincher Creek on a Tuesday in late March, when the snow was still holding on in the shadows of the Rockies, and the wind came off the mountains like it had a personal grudge. She had one trunk, a leather satchel that had belonged to her mother, and a letter in her coat pocket from a man named Fletcher Holt who had described himself as a steady man with a working property and no patience for nonsense. She'd read that letter 11 times on the journey west. Each time, she liked it a little less. Fletcher Holt was waiting at the post office because he hadn't thought to wait at the coach stop. A boy of about 12 ran to fetch him when the driver announced a passenger for the Holt property, and so Cordelia stood in the cold for 20 minutes before a man came around the corner on a gray horse, moving without urgency, as though a woman waiting in the March wind was not a matter that required speed. He was older than she'd expected. Not old, 40, maybe 42, but weathered in the way of men who work outside their whole lives and never once think to wear a hat properly. He had a beard that needed attention and hands that were clean only because it was a meeting day. He looked at her like he was pricing livestock. "You're smaller than I figured," he said. Cordelia looked back at him for a long moment. "You're quieter than I hoped," she said, "but I suppose we can't all get what we want." Fletcher Holt said nothing to that. He climbed down, picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing, tied it to the back of the horse, and told her the ranch was an hour's ride south. He didn't offer to let her ride. She walked beside the horse the entire way, and she didn't say a word about it, and neither did he, and that was how they started. The Holt property sat at the base of a long ridge, backed into the foothills like it was hiding from something. There was a main house, solid, 2 rooms, with a wood stove that worked and windows that didn't. A barn that needed a new roof on the east side, a chicken run, a smoke shed, and about 400 acres of grazing land that Fletcher ran with the help of one hand. A quiet Métis man named Aubrey who nodded at Cordelia when she arrived, and then went back to splitting wood as though the arrival of a mail-order bride was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. Cordelia stood in the kitchen of the main house and understood several things at once. There had been no woman on this property in a long time. Not because it was dirty. Fletcher kept things clean in the blunt functional way of men who have no interest in comfort but understand the value of order. It was the absence of small things. No curtains, no jar of dried herbs on the windowsill, no chair pulled close to the stove for sitting rather than working. The house was a place to sleep and eat and nothing else, and it had been that way for years. And Fletcher Holt had looked around it one day and decided that the solution was to write a letter to a matchmaking agency in Winnipeg. She unpacked her trunk into the smaller of the 2 rooms. Hers, apparently, and she noticed he'd put a new hook on the back of the door, which was the only preparation he'd made. And she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the wind. She had not come here out of love of adventure. She'd come because her father's dry goods store in Portage la Prairie had burned to the ground in November, and her father had gone with it, and her uncle's solution to the problem of an unmarried 26-year-old niece with no property and no income was to put her name in with the agency before she'd fully finished grieving. She had agreed because the alternative was teaching school in her uncle's town for the rest of her life, and she'd rather freeze to death in the Alberta foothills than spend 40 years being grateful to a man who smelled of pipe smoke and self-satisfaction. That was the thing she hadn't told Fletcher in her letters, that she wasn't here for a fresh start. She was here because there was nowhere else to go. The first 3 weeks were a negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. Cordelia took over the kitchen not because she was asked, but because someone had to. And she was faster with a stove than Fletcher, who cooked with the grim efficiency of a man completing a chore. She made bread on the second morning, and he ate half a loaf, standing at the counter, and said nothing about it, which she interpreted as approval. She found a crack in the south wall of the house that had been letting in cold air for what looked like years, and told him about it at supper. He looked at her for a moment, then went and looked at the wall, then went to the barn and came back with the materials to fix it. He did not say thank you, and she did not expect him to. Aubrey watched all of this from a careful distance. He was not unfriendly, just quiet in the way of a man who has learned that watching is often more useful than speaking. In the second week, he showed Cordelia where the good fishing spots were in the creek, without being asked, because he'd seen her looking at the water from the ridge and made his own calculations. She brought back 3 trout that afternoon, and Fletcher looked at them on the kitchen table, and then looked at her and said, it wasn't much, but it was something. The trouble with living that close to the bone, that close to the cold and the work and the silence, was that there was no hiding. In a town, you could be a version of yourself. You could keep the difficult parts private. Out here, there was no audience to perform for, and the performance dropped away fast. By the end of the first month, Cordelia knew that Fletcher Holt was a man who worked himself to the point of pain rather than ask for help, that he lay awake most nights because he did it, and that he had a tenderness with animals that he'd never once turned on a person. She knew he had bought this land at 23 with money he'd earned working cattle drives through 3 brutal winters, and that he had never once regretted it, and never once been fully happy in it either. She knew all of this because she watched, the same way Aubrey did, and the land was quiet enough that you couldn't miss anything. She also knew by the 4th week that there was trouble coming. His name was Douglas Reach. He had a property north of Pincher Creek, twice the size of Fletcher's, and he'd been trying to acquire the Holt land for 7 years, through means that started polite and had been getting less so ever since. Cordelia heard about him first from the woman who ran the general store in town, a stout, decisive woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who told her 3 things on the morning of Cordelia's first supply run: that the bread in the store was better than the bread she made herself, that Douglas Reach had been offering Fletcher increasingly unreasonable deals for the land, and that Fletcher had told him no in ways that grew shorter each time until the last one had been a single syllable that left no room for interpretation. "And how's Reach taking that?" Cordelia asked. Mrs. Fenwick looked at her over the counter with the expression of a woman who is deciding how much truth a newcomer can handle. "About how you'd expect a man like that to take anything," she said. The specifics arrived in pieces over the following weeks. A section of Holt fence cut in the night, which meant 2 days of work to repair, and 2 cattle gone before they noticed. A rumor in town that the Holt property had a water rights dispute pending. Not true, but the kind of thing that discouraged buyers if Fletcher ever needed to sell. And then a man who started showing up at the edge of the north pasture, just looking, not doing anything a person could point to, but there every few days like a reminder. Fletcher said nothing about any of it. This was, Cordelia was learning, his primary strategy for every problem. Silence and work, until one or the other resolved itself. She had a different strategy. She rode into Pincher Creek on a Wednesday without telling Fletcher she was going, because she knew he would have told her it wasn't her business, and she had already decided it was. She went to the land office and asked, in the direct, pleasant way she'd learned, from watching her father manage difficult suppliers, to see the public records for the surrounding properties. The man behind the desk was young, and tried briefly to be obstructive, and then found that he couldn't maintain it under her steady attention. She spent 2 hours with those records. What she found was that Douglas Reach had a water allocation from a tributary creek that crossed 3 properties before it reached his, and that the allocation had been registered on the basis of an agreement with the previous owner of the middle property, who had sold that land 4 years ago. The new owner, a farmer named Bertrand, who grew barley and minded his own business, had no knowledge of the arrangement and had never been asked to sign anything, which meant Reach's water allocation rested on an agreement with a man who no longer owned the land it concerned. Cordelia wrote this down in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, thanked the man at the land office, and rode home. She put the notebook on the kitchen table that evening after supper, opened to the relevant page, and went to make tea. Fletcher picked it up without being asked. She watched him read it from the corner of her eye. He read it twice. Then he put it down and looked at the wall for a while. "How'd you know to look for that?" he finally said. "My father ran a business for 20 years, she said. People tried to squeeze him out fairly often. He taught me what to look for." Another long silence. The stove ticked. "This could be useful," Fletcher said. "Yes," said Cordelia. "That was the idea." He didn't say thank you that time either, but the next morning, he saddled her horse without being asked before he saddled his own, and she noticed. The fence cutting escalated in early May. Reach wasn't doing it himself. He had men for that, men who were careful not to be seen, but everyone within 20 miles knew who was behind it, and knowing and proving were different things. Aubrey started sleeping in the barn with a rifle, which he did without being asked or told, simply because it was the practical thing, and he was a practical man. Cordelia started keeping a log of every incident, date, time, what was damaged, what was lost, what the conditions were. She tied in witness accounts where she could get them. Bertrand had seen one of Reach's men on the road the night of the worst fence cut, though he hadn't known at the time what it meant. The log was meticulous. It was also, she knew, only useful if there was someone to give it to. She wrote a letter to a solicitor in Calgary, whose name Mrs. Fenwick had given her. She wrote it carefully, over 2 evenings, and she wrote it in her own name rather than Fletcher's, because she'd learned enough about him by then to know that he would not have written it himself, that he believed the land should be won by work and weather and not by papers and courtrooms, and that this belief was going to cost him everything he had if someone didn't act on his behalf despite him. She did not tell him about the letter until after she'd sent it. That conversation was the first real argument they had. He was not a man who raised his voice. Neither was she. The argument happened at the kitchen table in low, controlled tones, and it was worse for it because nothing was cushioned by volume. He said she had no right to make decisions about his property without his knowledge. She said that someone had to, since he'd been watching the situation worsen for a year while doing nothing that could actually stop it. He said he didn't ask for her interference. She said he didn't ask for much of anything, and the things he should ask for he refused. And the things she could help with he was determined to handle alone, and at some point that stopped being self-reliance and started being pride with nowhere useful to go. The silence after that was a different kind of silence than they'd had before. He went to the barn. She washed the supper dishes. An hour later he came back and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, with the expression of a man doing something genuinely difficult, "You might be right." It was not an apology. But from Fletcher Holt, in that kitchen, at that moment, it was as close as it got, and Cordelia understood it as such. "I know I am," she said, not unkindly. "The solicitor's name is Hargrove. He's in Calgary. He'll write back within the week." Fletcher stood there another moment. "Right," he said, and went to bed. Hargrove came in person, which neither of them expected. He was a compact, methodical man with a briefcase and an interest in the water allocation question that went beyond the case itself. It turned out there were 2 other landholders in the region who'd had similar problems with reach, and the pattern was clear enough that Hargrove believed there was a strong foundation for a formal complaint to the Territorial Land Office. He sat at Cordelia's kitchen table, because that was where people sat now, and he spread the documents across it and walked them through it piece by piece. Fletcher listened without speaking for most of it. At the end, he asked 2 questions, both precise, both about the specific mechanics of how the water rights reversal would affect his northern boundary. Hargrove answered them and looked at Fletcher with the expression of a man recalibrating. "You've thought about this carefully," Hargrove said. "She thought about it," Fletcher said, with a nod toward Cordelia. "I just listened." It was the first time, in 2 months of living in that house, that she'd heard him give her credit for anything in front of another person. She kept her face still, but she felt it land somewhere. The formal complaint moved slowly through the bureaucratic machinery of the Territorial Land Office, as things did. In the meantime, Reach backed off the fence cutting, not out of goodwill, but because Hargrove had sent a letter outlining the evidence, and even Reach understood that the ground had shifted. The man at the north pasture edge stopped appearing. The rumors in town dried up. Mrs. Fenwick told Cordelia, with great satisfaction, that Reach had been seen in a lengthy conversation with his own solicitor that had not appeared to go well. The summer came, and with it the work that left no time for anything else. The cattle needed moving to the high pasture. The roof of the barn needed fixing before the next winter, and they fixed it over 3 weekends, the 3 of them. Fletcher, Aubrey, and Cordelia, who had never been on a roof before and learned faster than Fletcher expected, which she could tell by the way he stopped offering instructions and started working beside her as an equal. Hargrove's case worked its way through channels. Bertrand signed an affidavit, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, in the heat and the dust and the argument about whether to buy 3 more heifers they could barely afford, which they argued about for 4 days and then did because the numbers, when they sat down and looked at them together, actually supported it. Something shifted between them. It didn't happen in a moment. It happened in pieces, the way the seasons changed out there, gradually and then all at once. Fletcher started telling her things, not everything. He was still a man made of large silences, but things, about the property, about his plans for it, about the years before she arrived when the winters had been long in a way that went beyond weather. She started telling him things too, about her father, about the store, about the particular grief of losing someone you hadn't finished knowing yet. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without comment until he had something worth saying. When she told him about watching the store burn from across the street, unable to get through the crowd, he was quiet for a long time and then said, "That's a hard thing to carry by yourself." Yes, she thought. Yes, it is. They were not soft people, either of them. They didn't become soft. But the sharpness between them, the mutual suspicion of the first weeks, the careful distance that went. In its place was something harder to name and more durable. The kind of regard that comes from watching someone make good decisions under pressure, and being watched in return, and finding out you can bear being seen. The formal ruling came in September. Douglas Reach's water allocation was ruled invalid for the section crossing Bertrand's land, pending renegotiation. It wasn't a complete victory, these things never were, but it was enough to make expansion in Reach's direction significantly more complicated, and the land office's renewed attention to the matter made further interference with the Holt property a risk Reach was no longer willing to take. He sold his north parcel the following spring, Cordelia heard later, moved to Calgary. She heard it from Mrs. Fenwick on a morning in late September. When she rode into town for supplies and sat for 20 minutes at the small table, Mrs. Fenwick kept at the back of the store for conversations that mattered. "He won't be back," Mrs. Fenwick said, with the finality of a woman who had watched this valley for 30 years and could read its weather in all forms. "No," said Cordelia. "I don't think he will." She rode home in the late afternoon light, which did something extraordinary to the foothills at that hour. Lit the ridges from below, turned the dry grass amber, made the mountains in the west look like something a person had painted rather than something the world had made. She'd been looking at that view for 6 months now. She still couldn't get used to it. Fletcher was in the yard when she got back, repairing a section of the paddock fence, unhurried and precise the way he did everything. He looked up when she came through the gate. "Reach is gone," she said. "Sold the north parcel." He turned this over for a moment. "Good," he said. "Mrs. Fenwick says he won't come back. She'd know," he said. He went back to the fence, then, without looking up, "There's stew on the stove. Started it this morning." Cordelia stood in the yard for a moment, with the late light on her face. She had not come here for this. She'd come here because there was nowhere else to go, because her world had burned down, and her uncle had solved her like a problem to be managed, because a letter from a stranger in Pincher Creek had been the only door left open. She had arrived in the cold on a Tuesday, with one trunk and a satchel, and a grief she hadn't told anyone about, and this man had looked at her like livestock and told her she was smaller than expected. 6 months later, he had made stew and left it on the stove. She went inside and took off her coat and hung it on the hook on the back of her door. The hook he'd put there before she arrived, the only preparation he'd made, which she had thought at the time meant nothing, and understood now meant everything he was capable of then. People don't expand all at once. They expand in the direction of whoever's next to them, if the person next to them is patient enough and stubborn enough and refuses to leave. She ladled out 2 bowls of stew and set them on the table. Fletcher came in from the yard, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down across from her. Outside, the foothills went amber, and then deep gold, and then blue in the long Alberta dusk. The stove ticked. Somewhere in the barn, Aubrey was doing whatever Aubrey did in the evenings. She'd never asked, and he'd never said, and she respected that. They ate without talking for a while, comfortable silence, which was the only kind she'd ever trusted. "We should look at the south fence next week," Fletcher said. "I was thinking the same thing," said Cordelia, and that, in the end, was enough.